Welcome to another episode of The Warrior's Walk. I'm Keith and this is Todd. And we wanted to do a special episode as we conclude Mental Health Awareness Month on what every combat soldier needs to hear. So stay tuned for today's episode. Now, Todd, it's no surprise as a Navy SEAL veteran that you were in combat. I think you spent a little bit of time in combat. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah.
And so with that, we wanted to just kind of talk about how passionate you are in helping other combat veterans that have gone through maybe similar experiences that you have. We're going to talk a little bit about today, just your own experience and kind of readjusting back to quote normal life, outside of the military and getting back to and some of the results of your life that you were hyper vigilant for so long in the military and how that plays out into your normal life today. So before we get into that, what has been one of the hardest things, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but hardest thing from going as a Navy SEAL into a pastor, because that's not always typical for a retired Navy SEAL. A lot of different jobs out there that they transition to, but not as typical as a pastor. So you're kind of unique in that. What are some maybe unique challenges that you've had to go right into as you've transitioned from a Navy SEAL into a pastoral role?
Yeah, the biggest thing that comes to mind is my wife and I and the kids, like we were able to lead a very private life. Mm-hmm. Being a military guy and specifically the SEAL teams, like it was an expectation that you didn't talk about work. And so it wasn't necessarily that it was all secret squirrel stuff. It was just that was just how we conducted things in our home. And I would say most of the guys did in their homes as well. But then transferring over into, ministry, it becomes a very public life. And so we would say you're in a fishbowl, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody had input into our lives when it was private. And now, sometimes it feels like everybody thinks they have input into your life when it's public. And so It definitely is quite a transition. I think the other big transition was, this is a big shocker for everybody listening, I'm sure, but I was surrounded with a bunch of alpha males in the SEAL teams. And so it was kind of easy to lead in some ways because we were all wired the same and we all responded with physical violence and other techniques for
I think you would just lock each other in a box to figure things out.
Sometimes the Connex box therapy worked really well. Two guys go in and they learn to become friends, right? And so transferring over to the church world, I learned that, you don't have Connex boxes around. And so there's just a different way to lead people and maybe even different types of emotions on display. So definitely big changes.
One of the things that I know we had to work with you on was birthdays weren't very celebrated in the military. And so but as a staff, like we're always trying to celebrate each other's birthdays and it's kind of cultural, like to do something special. But for the longest time, you wouldn't even tell us when your birthday was.
Yeah. I still twitch about that.
Yeah. I think there were some opinions on that from previous life. So Now when we hear a combat soldier, the phrase combat soldier, what we don't want to do is to diminish anybody that's not seen combat, that are still serving in the military. And we talked to this a little bit about this before we started filming, about how you're even really intentional about encouraging people when you were active duty, no matter what they were doing. And so tell us a little about that and your heart for people that are serving, even if they're not seeing quote combat like Navy SEALs were.
Well, one example for background for those listening is we drank the Kool-Aid pretty hard when we go through training. They have a big sign that says, be someone special. And so when you graduate, you think you're someone special and shocker, right? But then at some point you need to mitigate that and start to come back to reality. And so one of the greatest places I learned to teach my guys was on aircraft carriers. Here's this giant ant colony of 6,000 people roughly, right, when the air wings are there. And I would point out to my guys and, prayerfully they would listen. But I'm like, you see the kid back there peeling potatoes? Like if he doesn't do his job correctly, then the cook doesn't make good chow. And then that helo mechanic walking by is frustrated because he didn't like what he ate that night. And his mind's still on that when he goes back to his job. He misses a check on that helicopter. We all crash and die. And I said, we need everybody. And then I would even try to teach the pilots, and the SEALs and the pilots, they always have a little bit of a rub, even though we're on the same team. And it's just good old rivalry stuff. But I would say, when's the last time you went down to the catapult room and thanked those 17, 18-year-olds who are wearing ice pack vests in 130-degree boiler rooms, dialing the pressure? Because if they don't dial up the pressure, from my understanding, you guys crash and die. So maybe you should go down there and thank those teenagers who were lied to by a recruiter, most likely. Oh, sure, you'll be a pilot.
Yeah.
And so I think at some point, most people in the military develop a certain level of maturity and respect for all those different roles. And then the classic that we would all acknowledge, any vet listening right now would acknowledge, even though it's frustrating, is, PTSD, not PTSD, that's probably what it gives you. PSD, the basic, every service has a place where they handle your pay. And you don't think they're important until you're not getting paid, right? And then all of a sudden, that's the most important place in the world, because if you can't pay your bills, then you can't think about your job. So everybody's important, right? And then I think my job was also, and I just recognized, one, I was a believer when I was in the SEAL teams, is also, just recognizing these roles that maybe didn't get the limelight. Like, we definitely were tip of the spear and you got a lot of fanfare, but also thanking these other fine young men and young women for serving, because their roles were important.
Yeah, definitely. Now, what are some unique struggles that veterans that have been in combat have that we want to address today? So what are some unique struggles what do they have, combat veterans?
It's a good question. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about that. I would say for the listener, the biggest thing I'd want you to walk away with is that, and especially listeners that are combat vets, is that each story is unique, right? And so I have had teammates that were hard as nails that one combat deployment was one combat deployment too much. I've seen others do multiple combat deployments and they did fine. And so everybody had their threshold on what they could experience. And I think there's too many variables there to really pick and choose and say this is why. But I mean, it could go back to childhood. It could go back to a lot of things, right? But so everybody's wired differently. And so I can't look at you if you're my teammate and you're shaking like a leaf after one engagement and say, well, what's wrong with you? Suck it up. And you need to be tough. Like, there's something else going on, right? And so I just need to appreciate and recognize, hey, I need to take care of my teammate, right? And so I think that's important for those who are listening, is to recognize, don't evaluate yourself and your performance based off somebody else. Like, you're a unique individual. God's made you a certain way. And for some, what they experience is too much. I remember one story. Here's a classic example. I think this one broke my heart. It's appropriate that this little, I don't know what you call it, but statue. We'll call it a statue. So a pretty cool gift that was given to me where I was doing chaplain care with my wife for some wounded vets down in Florida. And it was a wonderful program. But while I was down there, a lot of the stories I didn't necessarily sync up with. Some of them, I'd say they might have been stretching their diagnosis a bit. But again, I've learned, don't judge. I wasn't there. But there was a ranger that I met there. And he was devastated from war. And he specifically was in Ramadi. A lot of people listening, they're very familiar with Jocko and Task Unit Bruiser and all those guys. And they certainly did some wonderful things over there. But he was one of the Rangers involved at the same time frame in Iraq, specifically in Ramadi. And he went out on a patrol one night. And him and his two buddies, they saw a kid coming around the corner. And they're like, oh, he's got a broom on his shoulder. So they put down their weapons, and he actually had a rocket, and he shot it, and he killed both his buddies. So they both died. He got a little bit of frag, but not enough to go home. So he was treated in country. A couple weeks later, if I remember right, he was back out on patrol with two other guys, and they rounded a corner. Same profile presented. It was a kid with something on his shoulder, and he shot and killed him. It was a broom. That devastated him. And I think for those listening, if we're not careful back home, we can judge that young man and say, how could he kill a kid? But what they don't understand is that young man is in war, and based off of past experiences, it influences future decisions, right? Yeah. And so my job was to come alongside him and his wife and really help him understand, you didn't do something wrong. You were in war, and it was an awful situation, right? And so those are hard, and those are legit things that keep people up at night. He was hypervigilant to the extreme. He could not sleep. I mean, he's walking around the hotel. I walked around with him at night. And so, that's one example of, what someone will process and deal with. And so it's so unique. And I think what I've learned is one of the most helpful things is to actually sit down with other buddies and just talk. And it's good to be heard, right?
Yeah.
And without judgment. And again, if someone finds themselves, listening, you want to judge these different people, like I would just caution you, like if you were not there, don't judge, like, because there's just too many variables missing that you don't understand.
Well, and we were talking about this before too, and even with a lot of different counseling aspects, there's a tendency to think that you're the only one that's ever gone through something similar, and so there's a lot of isolation with combat veterans, right? That they think that they're the only ones dealing with the heaviness that they're experiencing. And so this leads into our next question is, what do many combat veterans wish other people around them knew? So maybe that haven't been to combat, and I think that's the tendency to where they don't feel like they can be open and share with people like their spouse maybe, or family members or friends that haven't experienced a similar thing. But what do they wish that these friends and family knew to support them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and again, I can only speak really from my perspective, to be fair, but I think one, it's knowing that there probably is a person there that does have some hurt. And, I've learned also, like, for those listening, if you're angry, I've learned this before I came into pastoral ministry, but I would say every book I've read, every case I've been involved with, if someone's angry, behind that anger is hurt, like 100% of the time. And so when you meet someone who's angry, because a lot of times that's how this stuff manifests, right? Like you have a veteran that's super angry. A lot of times, I think current stats up to 23, people who have PTSD and anger issues and they're just hypervigilant, 20% are also going to manifest with addictions, right? Because they're self-medicating. They're just trying to find an escape from the pain of the memories, right? And so again, I think one, for the outsiders looking in, like they probably want you to know, like, I'm hurt. And the best way to explain this is, like, if you came to me and you said, Todd, I am so angry, like, well, I'm probably going to like be on defense, because I'm like, well, you're angry at me, then I'm going to be angry at you, Keith. Yeah. So I'm bowing up. But if you came to me and you said, Todd, I'm so hurt, like, my nervous system, I'm going to react totally differently to that statement, right? I mean, like, well, how can I care for you? And so for the listener, I would say, as you meet these different vets, just realize what's presenting as anger is actually hurt, and they need help. And a lot of times that help could be something as simple as just talking, especially, I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this is May is mental, health awareness month. And so it breaks my heart how many teammates I've lost to suicide. There's a host of reasons for that, but it's not just SEALs, it's veterans in general. It's also, law enforcement, firemen, EMS. Like, there's a lot of people on the front lines of various capacities that are taking their lives. And so I think this stigma that, it's not okay to talk about it is wrong. And we need to just dispel that, and we need to get people to come out and say it's okay to talk about your struggles. Like, who doesn't have issues? And going back to your loneliness comment, right? I think we don't have to be original on our thought pattern here. I mean, that's how the devil hunts, right? He wants to isolate us. He wants us to think we're the only person. He wants us, especially us men, like, he wants us to think, we're the only ones dealing with some type of secret addiction. We're the only ones that are dealing with a failed marriage. We're the only ones that are horrible fathers, et cetera, et cetera. We're the only ones that can't handle finances, and on it goes. And yet, when you pull back the veil, you realize almost everybody around you is dealing with it too.
Yeah.
And then that dispels the darkness, and you realize, well, then let's figure out a way out of this. Right. And then that's where you can get around a myriad of counselors, and you can actually get some really good wisdom given to you on how to navigate it. Because, I mean, in the military, we're hardwired like problem solution. Now, that can get you in trouble sometimes in a marriage. I've learned that's another episode we'll talk about. But, for me, I'm just like, well, here's the problem. Well, here's a solution. And sometimes that's not what people need. Right. And I've learned over time, and I would encourage people listening, if you find someone venting, it's probably a good up front just to say, do you want to be heard, or you want to be helpful? And do you want me to actually give you some guidance, or do you want me just to listen? Because sometimes people just need to talk. And I think that can be really therapeutic.
Yeah.
Can be super helpful.
That's huge. So now as we shift gears, let's talk a little bit about some of the terms that people might have when it comes to combat veterans or combat soldiers. What is TBI, and what's been your experience with that?
So TBI is traumatic brain injury, and I've had quite a bit of experience with it, unfortunately, and that it manifested for me after hundreds of concussions documented. They have a formula, and I remember at Walter Reed, I think they landed on 600 for me, but, from micro concussions to actual concussions, and full well knowing, as an 18 Delta background and a SEAL, one concussion can change your life. And so I remember meeting with the second leading research doctor of TBI, and she told me, she goes, and she wasn't a believer, but she said, you should be really thankful because it's a miracle you can even drive and find locations, let alone function and speak. And I don't even know how you preach and can remember Bible verses and all the other things you do. So you should count yourself very lucky, which of course I know, God's sovereignty and protection is there. But all those compliments don't do anything when you have 25 migraines a month that last up to 36 hours and you get 8 hours off. And so my experience with it was, for a span of 13 years, the last 3-4 on active duty, I was having up to 25 migraines a month from TBI. And I was able to endure for a certain season, but the last couple of years I was running out of gas and super dark days. And, I think now I feel more comfortable. Before, I wouldn't disclose, everything I was feeling, but there's days I didn't want to play anymore. And I certainly understood why people kill themselves. I mean, I was broke. I was hurt. My wife was scared. I mean, she was just like, I don't know what to do. And I didn't know how to ask for help. And so I think when I was at my lowest, I had a very good friend, Hung Cal. He's a retired EOD Navy captain. He and I actually were doing, in parallel to all this chronic pain, research for hyperbaric chambers to treat TBI. Not just for vets. We were treating NFL folks and a bunch of other people. But we presented to the VA our findings because Hung Cal at the time, he was the diving commanding officer for Panama City. And so he had access to the chambers to do the blind studies and all that. The VA in DC was like overwhelmed. They're like, this is awesome. Now you guys need to go to the other 164 VA sites or however many there are and brief them because they're all independently run. And I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, I'm a pastor. Like, I don't have the time or the budget to do that. And so it kind of died in the water there. Meanwhile, Hung Cal, every couple months, he would just send me a text like, when are you going to get help? When are you going to go get help? When are you going to go get help? And finally, I think it was just one of those where I was like, I need help. And there's a couple scary nights for me where I was just like, I think what was helpful also, there's a couple things, so bear with me if you're listening. One, I was heartbroken over all the guys that had killed themselves that I knew. And I also would get together with all the guys on Zoom calls or in person, and we would meet and we would all nod north and south. It never makes it better for those left behind, right? Ever. The wives and the kids are devastated. The families, they're torn apart. And yet, a couple months later, someone in that circle, in that conversation, would take their life. And so it reminded me this TBI is so real that the wires aren't touching. Like there's something broken upstairs. And so we really need to address it at the root cause. Like it's not about grit. It's not about, like being macho. It's like there's something wrong. And so there's a phenomenal lady that really folds into this conversation that God used to help save my life, I think. So her name's Debbie Lee. A lot of SEALs will know who she is, but her son, Mark Lee, who was in Task Unit Bravo with all those guys in Ramadi, he was the first SEAL to die in Iraq in 2006 from the Iraq invasion of 2003. And so Mark Lee, he died, and then Debbie Lee lost her husband before the Iraq war, if I'm not mistaken, to suicide. And so here's a woman who had tremendous loss in her life, and she chose to take that hurt and turn it into help. So she started a foundation, America's Mighty Warriors, and she created a way where chamber rides could be paid for, treatment. Kevin Lace, another guy who's a retired SEAL from that organization, who's now a PA out of Florida. He was one of the guys that I was underneath his care. So I think what was illuminating for me and my wife was they pay for these things called spectral brain scans, which even though I have a medical background, I really didn't know what those were. So they flew me down to Florida, and it's pretty sobering when you see the picture and you actually see what your brain looks like after they radiate you and they do this little scan. And my temporal regions were just wiped out, like they were black tissue death. And then they send you this 4-page document of all the issues you should have because of that. And so that was sobering. And then I did my 40 dives in a chamber. And we don't really have time in the episode to explain hyperbaric chamber dives, but it's not wet diving. It's like a pressurized tube where you breathe 100% oxygen at a prescribed depth. And the first 10 dives were horrible. Like, it was some of the worst migraines I ever had. But I was like, compared to the last 13 years, what do I got to lose?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to keep trying. And then it was like a light switch. Like, something happened. And they started to decrease in frequency and in severity. And then, after doing all 40, it really was like a new lease on life. I still have them, and then a year later, I got a grant to do 20 more dives. And today, like, I still get them every once in a while, but my meds are able to keep them under control. And so, like, that's just one example of a treatment protocol that's out there for vets. But I think the sad part is there are so many different groups that are trying to help veterans, but the veterans just don't know where to start. So, like, if you're a combat vet, America's Mighty Warriors is one organization that'll treat you. The other one, it goes with this, and before we go on to any other questions, is so Chad Robichaud, a friend of mine that we've brought out to our church to speak before, he has a phenomenal story. You can look him up. Has written plenty of books about it, but he started America's actually Mighty Oaks Foundation.
Yeah.
Mighty Oaks Foundation. And in this organization, like, God has so blessed it, so much so that the Marine Corps will even send people there on orders, and it's overtly faith-based. But Chad was not only Force Recon and did a lot of other cool stuff, attached to SEAL teams and other groups, he was also a champion in the UFC. So he has all the street cred to get a bunch of guys together and say, hey, you're a Navy SEAL, you're a Marine, you're a Green Beret, you're Army. Clearly that doesn't work. Let's talk about who does, and his name is Jesus. And so he tells people about Jesus Christ. And most of the people who go to this camp actually accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. What's a phenomenal stat from Chad's organization is that to date, as far as I know, not one person who's graduated that program has taken their life. And they've only had one divorce. And that to me is just staggering when you think of the thousands of people
in that community that's so prevalent. I mean, you've shared with me stats before, but I think you'd said like once a day, right? I mean, one person a day takes their life in that world, or
maybe I don't know what the current stats are, to be honest, on that one. So I would only be guessing. But I think what's staggering to me is, like, even not only the suicide prevention, but the lack of divorce. Like, because especially in the spec ops world, divorce rate is quite a bit higher than the regular married folks. And that's the other thing that you and I know as pastors, it's kind of sad, is the church stats aren't any different than the world. Like, we're still like 1 in 2 marriages fail, whether you're in the church or not. But here's one, like, bonus tip that I've been reading and studying in marriages lately. Married couples who pray together and close out their day every night, it's like 98.9% stay married. So, like, you want a pro tip on saving your marriage?
Yeah.
Pray together.
Yeah. Well, you just covered a lot of stuff there, including some resources. You said Mighty Oaks Foundation, and then what was the
America's Mighty Warriors.
Mighty Warriors.
And then the kind of the 911 out there for veteran and mental health is 988, and then you select one. 24/7, there's someone there. And then all you have to do is Google. We could spend the whole episode. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of 24/7 organizations, but find something, put it in your back pocket. And then if you aren't a vet, but you're listening, obviously, the same thing applies for you, but also think about, like, if you want to care for veterans, like, I've done this a couple times in my life. Sometimes if you don't know what to do, take someone to an ER. You can save their life.
Yeah.
Like, just step in and say, you know what? Do you love me? And do you trust me? Let me take you to the hospital. Like, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do, but I know this is the right thing to do. Let me get you safe.
Yeah.
So at least do that.
Yep, that's huge. And what do most people who have experienced war, so a combat soldier, what do they want other people to know that would help them to support them? So we talked a little bit about this, about like just their immediate family and stuff, but just generically, if you don't have a combat soldier, but you want to just kind of understand a little bit about the depth of sorrow that can come along with that and what they've been through. What are some things that you would hope that other people might know about someone that's really carrying some heavy and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's in some ways that's a really hard question, Keith. And again, I only feel qualified to answer for myself. Because I think there's a lot of perspectives out there. And I shared with you, I think one of the things that I learned for myself was if I got home from a hard deployment where there was a lot of combat or even seeing loss of life, if I got home on a Friday or Saturday, Sunday was too soon for me to go to church because I was still wrapped a little too tight. And I made the mistake of doing that once. I think I did get back like on a Saturday morning, and literally 24 hours later, I was sitting in a Sunday school class, and nothing was funny. Like the jokes people were cracking, and just everyone's behavior. I was like, what is wrong with these people? I felt like they were insensitive. I felt like they had no clue what was going on around the world. And to be honest, that fault was as much on me as anyone else, right? They weren't doing anything wrong. I just needed more time to decompress. So I think that's one thing is I think some people need a little space, just to decompress. And so I think that's healthy, knowing your own triggers and how you deal with those things. So I think that's one thing. And I'm sure there's 1,000 others. I'm struggling to think about, like what every person needs to know when you come back. But I would just say at some point, I think it's okay to ask somebody, especially if they're a friend, like, hey, is there anything you want to talk about? Because I think what I'm learning is talking about it is really healthy. And obviously there's some things people don't want to revisit. I mean, there's sometimes, like we're learning, like there's World War II vets that never opened up and shared any stories. My wife has an uncle who she got to receive the Congressional gold medal for her tribe, my wife being full-blooded Choctaw. She had an uncle that was a code talker in the European theaters, and he never told anybody anything. They didn't even know. And all of a sudden, like, we get all this paperwork, and she's going to Congress, to accept this gold medal that's now in the museum in Hugo, Oklahoma, as far as I know. Hopefully it didn't get lifted on the way, but it's like, it was just really cool. And then the family got a silver, congressional medal. And so I think sometimes, people just never want to talk about things they did. But I think for some, it's probably, healthy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's huge. Yeah. And now when it comes to, we talked about physical resources with the potentially even the dive chamber, you have even spiritual resources with the Mighty Oaks Foundation. But for people that are hurting right now that might be watching this, what is some spiritual encouragement that you can give someone to really help them, like, in this moment? I mean, those are more long-term programs, or a lot more involved to get involved with. But what is something that you can offer to a combat veteran now that's really struggling? What hope would you give them?
Yeah, for me personally, just hear my heart, like, as a retired Navy SEAL, and really even just like really not a SEAL at all. Like you hear the phrase, once a Marine, always a Marine. I'd say most people in our community, like, I was a SEAL. Like, I'm not a SEAL today. Like, the things I used to be able to do physically, like, I went running the other day and, my shadow was walking, and it was like, I used to run, right? I'm not a runner today. But if you're hurting today, I mean, one, know this, like, I believe with all my heart, Jesus Christ is the answer, right? And does that mean like your TBI pain is going to go away and all that? No. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. But to have hope, like to know that this life is so brief. And we've talked about this. We're not the originators of this illustration, but most of you vets know what a climbing rope looks like. And if we were to put 1 inch of tape in the middle of that rope, and if you could imagine that rope flaking off to eternity past and eternity future, and let's say God gives you 100 years to live, like, this life is so brief. It's a vapor. Just the other day in our Bible reading plan, I was reading, that a day with the Lord's like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day to the Lord. So in the mind of Jesus, he's been gone 2 days. And so we just don't have the same concept of time as God does. And so I would encourage you, don't get too worked up about this 1 inch of tape. but think about eternity. Like, where are you going to spend it? And you and I know, I mean, pretty passionate about this. We spend our lives doing this, is telling people about the gospel. You know, the Bible makes it clear that God created you with a relationship. Like, he wants to know you. He wants to be involved in your life. I mean, he made you. He knit you together in your mother's womb. And so how cool is that? But the Bible also has that bad news, you know, and it's just like, it's kind of a bummer, but it's true. It's like every one of us have a sin nature, and that sin nature separates us from a holy God. Mm-hmm. And I think the part that we struggle with in the West, and we've talked about this, is your sins can't be removed by good deeds. Mm-hmm. In some ways, I'm thankful for that narrative, though, because could you imagine heaven where it's this bragging contest? Like, how'd you get here? Like, well, I gave $100. Oh yeah, I gave 1,000. Yeah. Nowhere in the Bible does it describe that. Mm-hmm. Then that's where the gospel comes in. God knew that. That's why he sent his son, Jesus Christ, the perfect man. He lived that perfect life, fully man, fully God, and he knew no sin. And then he took that punishment that you and I deserve, and he died. And 3 days later, God raised him from the dead. And the part that I get super excited about all the time when I meet men and women, especially veterans who struggle with like, well, God can never forgive me. Mm-hmm. I point him to the Apostle Paul sometimes. If you don't know who the Apostle Paul was, he used to hunt and murder Christians. Mm-hmm. God forgave him and restored him and actually used him. And he wrote much of the Bible in the New Testament. So like, there is hope. And so that everyone means you. Like, if you're listening today, God can forgive you, restore you, and redeem you. And that eternal life begins today. So that's like primary of most importance to me to share with anybody. But then it's, don't be afraid to seek health. Mm-hmm. Even, you know, this is what, you know, Keith knows this, you know, and, you know, I was even like, to be honest, I was sitting on the fence whether or not to share this on a podcast, but like, I'm actually going through my own personal counseling right now because my hypervigilance was getting so out of control that it was just dominating me where I couldn't sleep. I'd hear a noise and I'm just like wide awake. I've been retired 13 years. Mm. And so even now, like, I need to learn to take a wrap off, and I have better tools at my disposal, but don't be afraid to seek help. It's so important. And so I'm thankful. It was neat to have someone who doesn't know me, non-judgmental, to connect dots from childhood, to see how I was wired, how I was made, how past events have shaped me for today. And so I don't necessarily want to lose all my hypervigilance. I think it's a good thing. I'm a shepherd. I want to care for people. I want to protect people, but I also need to keep it in check, right? And so that I can function. Yeah. And so I would just encourage you, one, if you don't know who Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, start there. Find you a Bible preaching church. If you don't know where to start, send us your zip code. We can respond and let you know, like, hey, here's some churches we know, or at least from their website, or maybe we know firsthand experience, they preach the word of God. Yep. So that might keep Keith really busy from answering, you know, a lot of comments, but like, that's how much we care. We want you to be in a Bible believing church. Sure. But then two, again, the VA is a great place. We like to badmouth the VA as vets, but there are men and women who actually care about us in the VA. So that's a great place. And whether you serve 1 year or you serve 50 years, they're there to serve you and to care for you. Mm-hmm. So start there, but get the help. And yeah, I can't say it enough. Like, don't go it alone.
That's huge. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I'm sure that's going to be helpful to a lot of people listening and watching. And so let's finish with a couple lighthearted rapid fire questions that I want to ask you. So we talked about this before. I think you had to do some research on your own collection, but what is your favorite knife?
Favorite knife?
Yeah. Or, I mean, weapon. Right. Yeah. Let's just expand it to weapon. Do you have a favorite weapon that you own?
Man. I mean, I have some, it's just too many. Like, I don't know if I want to tell everybody what my favorite is.
Yeah, you don't have
to go through the whole I mean, I have axes and knives, and I have, you know, more than one man should probably own, according to my wife. But I do have a fondness for sharp things, and so certainly Winkler axes and knives are some of my favorite, and he's contributed to our community a lot. I have some Swedish-made Viking axes that I think are pretty cool. Sweet. All those are wonderful. And then as far as weapons go, I mean, you know, and I have a wide variety. This is one of the drawbacks if you have a wife that knows weapons, though. I remember I was complaining one time, and she saw me. This was dial-up internet. I was in Alaska, and she saw me surfing the internet at a Weatherby page for a 300 Win Mag, and she actually was fluent enough to my demise. She goes, "Don't you have a Winchester Model 70 in 300 Win Mag?" And I was like, "Yes." She goes, so it seems to work okay. I see you bringing home deer and other animals. And I was like, yes. And she was like, so you're not going to buy another one, are you? And I was like, maybe. And again, we had 3 little kids. And so I realized the wisdom in what she was saying. So, but there are, like, when you talk about weapons, you know, and originally Keith was asking me, you know, what's some underrated ones? I don't know about underrated, but like, we have a lot of great American firearm manufacturers, right? From Ruger to Remington to Winchester to Weatherby, right? Smith & Wesson. And so, you know, I don't want to upset any of the folks out there. I think, and that's what's fun about talking about weapons. It's kind of like you want to cause a controversy, like step into the middle of the country and say, what's the best round for killing deer? Like, stand by for the ultimate debate, right?
Well, I mean, that's actually our most viral clip from this podcast was the caliber debate one.
Is it really?
Yeah, so
yeah, and so I mean, people have strong opinions on those things, and so and God bless them, you know. But I've just found that like a lot of them work, you know.
Yeah.
Each caliber, you know, and here's the one I don't think I talked about in that podcast, but I worked with this old timer. He went to my log cabin church, the log cabin church I attended in Kodiak, Alaska. His name was Larry Amex. He's with the Lord now. This guy was like one of the original professional seal trappers back in the 50s when it was legal, and you know, they were pumped up everywhere. But the only weapon that man ever owned was a 22 Hornet New England Firearms that cost him like probably $50, and his Tasco scope on there that was foggy and you could barely see through it. It's probably $10 when he bought it. He killed every animal in the state of Alaska with that weapon. He said, doesn't matter, like if it's a bear, a moose, or a seal, he's like, just hit them in the temple. It's got enough horsepower to get in there and drop them. And I was a skeptic until I went in his home and I saw all these carcasses and fur and antlers. And I'm like, well, and the only thing leaning on the wall was this cheap little New England Firearms 22 Hornet. So there you go.
Yeah. Now, what is your favorite movie of all time?
Man, it's definitely changed. I will say I don't know what my favorite is, but the running joke, Keith knows this. So for those of you in the military, most of you know what isopreps are. And that was, for those of you that don't know, that was a card where we base off of all of our info on if someone needed to recover us, if we were a prisoner of war or missing. They wanted to make sure they actually had Todd Peters. Like, my questions were based off of Jungle Book, the Walt Disney movie. And so I won't tell you what all my questions were.
Yeah, just in case.
Yeah, in case they call me back for the big one in a walker. But I think, you know, I'm like more lighthearted movies. You know, my wife and I actually, you know, this will upset the super Christian elite, but, you know, we went and saw Fall Guy last night, and it was just about stuntmen. It was actually a lot of fun. It was a fun movie, and I wouldn't recommend it from the pulpit, you know. But as far as, you know, just, again, like, we like action movies, but my heart gravitates towards the lighter side of things, you know, like just a good old-fashioned kid movie. Yeah. I'm just as good with those all day long.
Nice. Now, you've traveled a lot over the years, and is there any place that you would want to go back to that you've been to before? Maybe even take the family or the wife to travel back to a certain place.
Yeah, so I mean, I have some that, again, Keith knows this, where I've left certain messages for my wife, and so I won't disclose those because just in case she listens to an episode, this would be the one probably. Yeah. So that's one category. But then this is not a shocker for people who know me. My family would be thrilled if I packed them up and I took them back to Alaska, Kodiak Island specifically. Yeah. We had this one beach. We named it ourselves. It's hidden and appropriately called Sneaky Beach. But it's just like it was this really cool place where we could take our dog and the kids, and nobody could ever go find it. And we would just show up there, and is like a private resort. And so I think that was one of our favorite places, and so many great memories with my wife and kids, and seeing that goofy golden retriever running around. Like, it was just a lot of fun. And so I think we would go there in a heartbeat. Like, that'd be one of our ultimate trips.
That's awesome. Okay. Any, or if you can meet any historical figure, so maybe not someone that's alive, you can't say Jesus. Okay. So let's just eliminate that. You can't say anything from the Bible. So let's just say historical figure, not in the Bible. Who would it be that you'd want to meet?
Probably two different categories. So if I were to meet a Christian, I really have enjoyed the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And even though he didn't live very long, man, the life that he lived was impressive. And so if you don't know who he is, I would encourage you to look him up. He was martyred, and unfortunately right before World War II ended. But the insight that young man had was tremendous, and his writings, I think, influence a lot of people today. So that'd be one. And then I think, I don't know, like, I don't know if I've spent a lot of time and energy on, I'm not a big guy that wants to get autographs and all that stuff. I think people are people and they're interesting, but I don't get all googly eyed. But I always joke, I think it'd be fun, maybe just because he was a rough and tough guy. Lee Marvin was a guy that would have been kind of fun to meet. And then his sergeant at Iwo Jima. So if you don't know who Lee Marvin is, he was a Hollywood actor, but he was also a Marine on Iwo Jima. But I remember when I was a young boy, I saw him on the Tonight Show when Johnny Carson was the host, right? The original. And he was interviewing him, and he kept talking about his sergeant and how he took care of him on Iwo Jima, and then he ran and got other guys, and he said his name. I don't even remember his real name. He said, and the whole world has no idea who this sergeant is, but yet every one of you know who he is. And now all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank. But it was good grief, I am drawing a blank on this podcast.
Well, that'll be the cliffhanger so that they have
cliffhanger
next time.
Yeah, look him up. But it was I just remember it was like Mr. Green Jeans, and it was like Captain Kangaroo. Yeah. So Captain Kangaroo got like all these medals and Purple Hearts from Iwo Jima, but it was this goofy kid show, and he would bring on hosts, and like they're dancing around their overalls and stuff like that, but he was like this war hero from Iwo Jima. Yeah. So Captain Kangaroo, thank the Lord it came back to me. But I just thought that was cool that like Lee Marvin, who was like this Hollywood tough guy. So maybe Captain Kangaroo, that's who I'd want to be.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Why not?
Good stuff. Yeah. Well, this has been fun and very insightful. And yeah, so this concludes our episode of The Warrior's Walk. If you are watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe. There's still a large percentage of people that are watching our content that have not subscribed. So if you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do that. If you are listening to this on podcast, be sure to subscribe as well, so you get those episodes notifications right when they come out. And so thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.